Epilogue. Philip leaned back in his wicker chair and looked at the painting as he cleaned the brush in his hand. He was pleased. The painting was done and had only taken a few hours to finish. After he studied its definition and component parts for a short while, his mind began to relax and his focus changed as he tried to take in the tone of the images on the canvas. He had been sitting quietly looking at the painting for several minutes when Daphne's wave from the garden caught the corner of his eye. "Finished already?" said Daphne. "Yes, it's done." "I'll join you on the veranda then," she said as she walked toward her work table. "No, stay there. I'll be with you in a minute." Philip gathered up his paint supplies and brought them into the studio, then returned to the veranda to retrieve the painting and easel. He put the easel by his unfinished painting rack, then walked toward the gallery that was in a wide hallway connecting his studio addition to the main house. With its 2-story height and cathedral ceiling, it had a grace and grandeur that complemented the many paintings Philip had hung on its richly paneled walls over the years, and now he was about to add another to his collection. He hung the painting on a hook at the far end of the hall, near the entrance to his studio, the place where he put his other newer works as he considered their best location among clusters of similar themed works further down the hall. As he stepped back to eye the canvas from a distance and look at the faces of the 2 young men he had painted, the true beauty of his work suddenly struck him. Not only did this canvas physically dwarf the others around it, its colors and tones were so brilliantly balanced and vibrant that it made his other works appear two-dimensional and lifeless in comparison. Studying the handsome features of the young man in the forefront with richly textured golden locks, Philip shook his head. How could I have captured such beautiful imagery and in such a short sitting? This won't do. I must put it in a main cluster at the center of the hall. But where does it belong? Without thinking, Philip lifted the painting from its spot, carried it to the middle of the hall, and then hung it on an empty hook at the center of a grouping where he had planned to hang his painting of Old Red Eyes when it was finally finished. As he leveled the canvas, his mind caught up with his actions. Could such a spontaneous work of art fill the spot he had so doggedly left vacant for the magnum opus he had been slaving over all these years? Stepping back to view the canvas in the context of its new surroundings, the balance and completion it added was immediately apparent. Of course, what a fitting end to this grouping of images related to shared creativity, and in the very spot where he thought the central painting would differentiate those in its periphery from one another, he now found them all drawn together, like spokes gathered to their hub. He walked toward the studio as the images on the canvas lingered in his mind. The 2 young men looked like him and Kendall, yet in some ways they also looked like Daphne and Amber. He sensed a mystery here, and as he walked past Old Red Eyes glaring out at him from his unfinished painting rack on the way to the door, he was too deep in thought to notice. Daphne was watering a bed of lilies when Philip walked up behind her and put his arms around her waist. He kissed her neck and then nuzzled his chin into her shoulder to watch as she continued to sweep the watering can slowly back and forth above the flowers. "Do you have to water them today? They don't look dry," said Philip as he playfully rubbed her belly button. "No, I don't have to. Their roots are moist, but they enjoy the shower, and I enjoy giving it to them." She tipped the can upright and turned in his arms to look at him. "And would you like a shower this fine Sunday morning, monsieur?" said Daphne as she began to lift the can. "Why, yes, mademoiselle. These toes would enjoy the experience immensely," he said with a boyish grin. Philip slipped off his sandals, and Daphne sprinkled his toes with water, laughing as he wiggled his wet digits in the soft grass. "There, you shall make a fine flower some day," she said as the can sputtered dry. "Ah, but you are my fine flower, and it is I who should be watering you." He licked her cheek, and they both giggled. As they paused to savor the moment, Daphne suddenly realized how unusual it was for her husband to join her in the garden on a Sunday morning. "Say, my wet-tongued gardener, shouldn't you be starting another painting on the veranda right about now? The picnic doesn't start for another couple hours." "No, I'm done for the day," he replied. "But Amber and Kendall won't be here to distract you. They're out of town until Tuesday." "All right," said Philip. "If you insist, I'll paint some more." He took the watering can from Daphne's hand and held it up. "Here's my brush," he said, and then with a dramatic sweep of his hand around the garden he added, "and here's my canvas. Now, my love, show me what to do." For the remainder of the morning Daphne and Philip watered their flowers and tended the flower beds, sometimes working together and sometimes wandering apart. Whenever Philip had a question about how he should prune a flowering shrub or support a sagging plant, she would patiently show him and then watch as he performed the task on his own. Shortly after they had started to water the flowers, Celeste had strolled into the garden and began to follow them around, alternating between Daphne and Philip. When she stopped to give her owner's maid an especially quizzical look as he was watering a daffodil bed, he watered her tail, and she scampered off to the pool beside the willow tree, where she sat down to watch her human friends from a distance. As the morning drew to a close, Daphne cut some flowers from the lily bed, placed them in a basket to take into the house, and then went looking for her husband. He was standing by the hyacinth bed, staring at the white roses on the bush at its center. It was her turn to come up from behind and put her arms around his waist. As she stood on her tiptoes, snuggling her chin into his shoulder, he spoke. "We dreamed of a rose from that bush last week, but I can't quite remember when." Daphne nibbled his earlobe. "Perhaps it was Monday night. I remember you sketched a woman with a rose in her hair on Tuesday morning when I was fixing breakfast." "Yes, you're right. I'll look at my tablet later. Maybe it'll come back to me more clearly then." Daphne nibbled his ear again. "Well, my tireless artist, your garden painting is done for the day. Let's go to the picnic." Philip turned and kissed his wife, pleased that he had finished 2 paintings in one day, one tangible and one etheric. They turned and walked hand in hand along the winding paths between flower beds toward the house to get ready for their outing, and as they passed the lily bed, Daphne realized she had forgotten her flower basket by the hyacinth. While he waited for her to retrieve the basket, Philip took a deep breath through his nose as his eyes scanned the brilliantly colored and vibrant images surrounding him. After all these years of watching Daphne tend their flowers from the veranda, and his periodic excursions into the garden to walk with her as she worked, he had certainly seen the beauty of this place from both far and near, but this was the first time he had actually experienced it. He watched Daphne walk up the path toward him with the basket in the crook of her arm, and a peaceful sense of belonging overcame him. Perhaps it was time to paint with a watering can and forego his brushes for a while. They were talking to one another as they walked along the final bend in the road leading to the park, and when the woods which followed the brook beside them opened into a grassy meadow, Philip and Daphne stopped talking to look at their destination as it loomed up to greet them. When they were partway across the stone arch bridge that crossed the creek and marked the entrance to the park, they set down the basket of pears that they were carrying between them and lingered on the view for a moment. Mineral Springs Park was at the far end of the valley, close to the hills that rose toward the highlands in the distance, and although it wasn't the physical center of their world, nearly all the people who lived in Spring Valley considered this spot their spiritual center and a touchstone to the forces that animated their surroundings. Everyone who visited the park seemed to have a special place within its confines that beckoned them to individual centers within the center, and when community gatherings in the large open-air pavilion near the pool concluded, people tended to wander off toward their own unique spots to silently commune with their natures until they went home. Some were drawn to areas near the spring-fed pool at the far end of the park, where they would find a rocky outcropping or grassy knoll around its 100-yard perimeter to watch people as they waded in its waters or observe waterfowl as they swam near its edges. Others were drawn to areas near the brook that flowed from the right side of the pool, where they would watch the babbling water cascade down a spillway onto 3 steps of marble as it began its meandering journey through the valley on its way to distant lowlands. Still others sought out quiet spots under the various oaks that watched over the brook or lined the park's perimeter, while some sought solace in the large meadow in the foreground of the park. In all, there was hardly a place in the park that didn't attract someone, But at the moment everyone was gathered at the pavilion, a massive structure supported by large Ionic marble columns that stood apart from the beauty of its surroundings, yet somehow seemed to blend in naturally, as if it had grown from the ground beneath it. When a neighbor standing near one of the columns waved to them, Daphne and Philip picked up their basket and walked across the meadow lane to join the picnic. They placed their basket in the middle of a cornucopia of other fruits and vegetables on a large table in the center of the pavilion and began mingling with their neighbors. The pavilion was teeming with an overflow crowd at the community tables, and many people had gathered in small groups to sit in the grass around its perimeter. As was their habit, Daphne and Philip did not seek out any particular group or look for a specific place to sit, but they wandered among the crowd hand in hand, preferring serendipitous encounters to pre-planned rendezvous, and when they felt the urge, they would work their way toward the food table to select a tasty item to eat as they continued their mingling. Conversations were lighthearted and full of good humor, with occasional serious discussions between the people as they bartered for goods and services. Philip ran into a woodworking neighbor early in the afternoon, and he agreed to make a frame for his new painting in exchange for prunings from Philip's pear orchard that could be used in his wicker shop. Later in the afternoon, they found a neighbor woman who agreed to trade some vinca that Daphne wanted for a shady spot near the pool in her garden in return for some tulip bulbs the woman needed to start a new flower bed. As late afternoon approached, the picnic had run its natural course, and people began to scatter as the forces which brought them together began to dissipate. At first there was just a trickle of people leaving the pavilion, but after a short while the exodus gathered momentum, and within an hour the pavilion stood empty and silent as everyone left for home or sought out their special place in the park. Philip was sitting on a wooden bench near the mouth of the brook as Daphne waited on the first marble step of the spillway from the pool, several yards in the distance, when he spotted a smooth white stone on the ground next to him. He picked it up and looked at it, then rolled it in his hand unconsciously as he returned his gaze to Daphne. She waded over to an indentation in the step as she daintily gathered her dress around her knees, and then she began playing with something in the water with her toes. Philip was just about to stand up and join his wife when a hand squeezed his shoulder. "Hello, Philip," said a deep voice. Philip turned and looked to see his old friend standing there. "Hello, Avery. Mind if I join you?" "No, have a seat." Philip slid over on the bench and Avery sat down beside him. Not wanting a conversation at the moment, Philip returned his gaze to Daphne, hoping Avery would take the hint and maintain the silence. It worked for a while, but Avery had just recently moved to the Valley, and he hadn't yet caught on to the protocols and good manners of its residents. "Say, that's quite a bump on your nose," said Avery, after an awkward silence. "Yes, the old sniffer's grown since I last saw you. It's gone down during the week. It isn't still noticeable." Philip rubbed the bump on his cartilage bone just above his nostrils. "Well, I suppose not, but in profile it's obvious. What happened?" "I was opening the pantry door in the kitchen last Thursday morning when a loose screw in the hinge gave way and the door banged me in the nose." "Ouch." "Yes, it throbbed all day and wouldn't let up. Finally, in the late afternoon, I put a cold press on it and decided to lay down for a nap." Philip hesitated for a moment and then stifled a laugh when he suddenly remembered something. "Was it that funny?" No, I was just thinking about a silly little dream I had when I took the nap." Avery's ears perked up. Dreams were one of his favorite topics. Maybe we should analyze it." Philip thought back on it for a second. Then his cheeks puffed out as he stifled even a bigger laugh. "No, Avery," he said, "believe me, it was just a silly little dream." "Speaking of dreams," said Avery, "one of the Palladian elders from Elmwood is coming to Briarwood this Thursday to give a special talk on dreams. If you're not doing anything that night, I can stop by your house and we can walk down together." Leave it to Avery to turn a light conversation serious. Philip was in no mood to visit this topic, but there was something he had to say to his old friend, and perhaps if he bantered with him for a few minutes, it might soften the blow. "So, what's so special about this talk?" We've pretty much covered all the angles on that topic over the years, haven't we? This one's different. He's going to discuss whether our dream world really exists. Well, of course it exists, said Philip. We go there every night, don't we? No, I don't mean in our heads, but physically. He's bringing a book. Wait a minute, Avery. What's the point of all this? Interrupted Philip as he gave him a quizzical look. Point? Well, I don't know. Maybe it will help us understand our waking lives a little better, I suppose. Philip looked at the stone in his hand, and then at Daphne. She had seen Avery sit down with him a few minutes earlier, and now she was perched on a small granite boulder in the middle of the marble shelf, her knees pulled up to her chin as she watched the water swirl around its base. Philip really wanted to be with his wife right now, but he maintained his patience and tried to speed up the conversation. Look, old friend, we've studied a mountain of books over the years, a pile of them on dreams to figure out who we are, and an even bigger pile of them on paradise to figure out where we're going. Don't you think that maybe it's time to live in the present and quit rummaging around in the past and the future? Avery wrinkled his brow and cocked his head. But what fun would that be? He said. Philip smiled at his friend. Of course living in the mundane present held no appeal to Avery. He loved a mystery, and mysteries resided in the obscure past or the unknown future, didn't they? Philip didn't know if he could put into words what he was feeling, so he thought carefully as he spoke. It isn't a matter of fun, it's a matter of balance. Look, Avery, sometimes you think too hard. Just stop and look around you. Here's the 7 levels of paradise that you read about in your books all the time. There's the savanna to the south, the heaths, the valley where we live, the highlands to the north, the base of the mountain in the distance and its peak, and then there's the sun. Philip swept his hand in a wide arc around him as he spoke, finally pointing to the sun overhead. You don't have to think about any of it, just experience it. But this is just a shadow cast from paradise, Philip. It isn't the real thing. Don't you want to know what it's like? What's the purpose of it all? Not the real thing. It sure as hell seems like it while I'm here. And as far as wanting to know, what's the point? Just like the people in my dreams at night, I'll wake up from this dream of mine someday and know who I am. Until then, why spoil such good theater? Nitpicking over who wrote the lines or why we've been cast in the roles we play in this little nightly drama of ours takes all the fun out of it, don't you think? Speaking of that, the elder from Elmwood is coming back again to Briarwood next month to give a talk on lucid dreaming, and he's blah, 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 blah. Avery stared off into the distance, droning on to himself as Philip looked at him and shook his head. He wasn't listening, and like most of the people he knew from Briarwood, Avery simply waited patiently for you to stop talking so he could continue with his own train of thought. Philip wondered, was I like this when I first moved up from Briarwood? He didn't want to think about any of this anymore, so he changed his focus and looked at the stone in his hand, trying to remember something Kendall had said to him last Sunday about a rock. Finally it came to him, and he looked up at Avery babbling away, and then at Daphne as she sat quietly on the boulder. Suddenly it was perfectly clear to him. His what has been and what will be were right before his eyes. He stood up and put the stone in his pocket, then turned to Avery and interrupted his friend. "Excuse me," he said. "Blah, blah, blah." "What?" "Excuse me, but I have a picture that needs watering. A picture that—" "What does that mean, Philip?" "It means I won't be visiting Briarwood anymore, old friend. Good day to you." Philip turned and walked away. Philip slipped off his sandals, waded out on the boulder, and then looked at his wife as she stared at the water. "Would Mademoiselle care to play in the water for a bit?" he said. She looked up and smiled. "Why, yes, monsieur, I would like that." Philip lifted her by the waist and eased her toes into the water as she gathered her dress at her knees. They waited around the first marble step for a few minutes, and then Daphne showed him the goldfish she had been playing with in the indentation when Philip first sat down to watch her. They played with it again, letting it nibble their fingers as they fed it pulp from an acorn that had fallen into the water. When the last morsel was gone, Philip gently cupped the fish in his hands and put it back in the pool, where it had been before it was accidentally washed over the spillway onto the step. They walked down the marble steps to the brook below and followed its meandering bed as they held hands and chatted about the picnic. And when they came to a flat stone outcropping at a fork in the waters, they sat down to rest. Daphne laid her head on Philip's lap as he dangled his feet in the water, and they grew quiet as they watched the brook's lazy waters caress half-submerged rocks near the outcropping. Philip was unconsciously combing a wayward strand of Daphne's hair with his hand when she turned her head and looked up at him. "It was a lovely picnic today," she said. "Yes, it was, but I missed Amber and Kendall. It's one of the few times we've come without them," said Philip. Daphne sat up and started combing her hair with her fingers in the spot Philip had been combing. "They'll be home Thursday morning. Should we stop by after supper and bring them some pears? Another tree has ripened, and I've no room in the pantry for more right now." Philip gazed at the brook. He knew Daphne had heard Avery's wife talking about the Thursday evening meeting in Briarwood with a small group of people as they walked by them earlier in the picnic, and this was her way of asking if he was going. He didn't want to spoil the joy of the moment with a direct answer, so he replied with a question. "Do you recall someone's wife telling her husband earlier this morning that he might make a nice flower someday?" "Why, yes, I seem to recall that," said Daphne, with a quizzical look on her face. "Well, then," said Philip, "perhaps this fellow should bloom where he's planted." Philip kissed her gently on the lips and then looked into her eyes. Satisfied she understood his answer, he changed the subject. "There's something different about you today. I can't put my finger on it," he said as he looked her up and down. "Maybe it's this silly colic in my hair," she said, combing it with her fingers again. "I must have slept on it funny last night." "No, that's not it." He eyed her up and down once more. "Maybe it's the pimple on your forehead." "Where?" said Daphne as her hand came up. Philip laughed and tickled her rib. He was teasing her again. After she gave him a gentle nudge with her elbow, he got more serious. "I know what it is. You're wearing a different dress today." He stroked a silky fold in the pale peach fabric of the sundress gathered at her lap. She always wore a pale blue dress to their Sunday outings, and he had noticed the dress as soon as she put it on earlier in the day, but this was the first time he had commented on it. "Yes, it's time for a change. I packed the other one away," she said. "I like the color. It matches your mood." She was in a cheerful mood, except for a twinge of melancholy in the air that went unnoticed by Philip when he first walked up to her as she was sitting on the boulder near the pool. And he rightly sensed her good spirits had something to do with the time they had spent in the garden that morning. He squeezed her hand lightly and looked up through the gently swaying branches of the oak trees surrounding them. The moon had begun to eclipse a tiny corner of the sun. The day was coming to an end and nightfall had begun, so they stood up to begin the walk back home. They followed the path next to the brook, and when Philip stopped to put his sandals on near the wooden bench by the pool, Daphne looked at the boulder on the spillway as the branches of the large oak tree beside her whispered something in the rustling air above. A brief twinge of melancholy flitted through her consciousness for a final time, and then disappeared unnoticed. She was too preoccupied to feel it as she thought about her new special spot in the park, on the little outcrop of rock overlooking the brook where the waters forked. They stopped at the empty pavilion to retrieve their basket, and when they walked across the stone-arched bridge on their way out of the park, Daphne glanced back for one last look at the butterflies flittering about the wildflowers in the meadow behind them. As they walked away, she decided she would never sit on the granite boulder again. They were just stepping onto the walkway to their front door when Philip heard the guttural caws of the blackbird. He walked quickly around the side of the house as Daphne tried to keep up, and when he looked up to see his old nemesis circling over the cottonwood tree next to their bedroom window while his sparrow screeched frantically from twittering branches, he stopped dead in his tracks and pulled the stone from his pocket. "Damn you to hell," said Philip, as he took aim and heaved the stone into the air. The stone flew upwards over the tree, and just as it began to arc slightly, the crow flew into its path. The clawing interloper stopped in midair, pulled in its wings, and then fell straight to the ground, landing with a small thud as the stone fell next to it. Philip walked over to the bird and was just leaning over to stare at its upturned legs when Daphne finally caught up to him and leaned over to see what had happened. Both their jaws dropped when they realized the bird was dead. "That old scalawag has been stealing eggs and terrorizing my sparrows for years. I can't believe he's dead," said Philip, still dumbfounded by the sheer luck of his toss. "Well, you certainly taught him a lesson this time," said Daphne. They looked at each other and then back at the crow, then burst out laughing until chirping from the cottonwood finally caught their attention. Philip looked up at his sparrows and tried to count them as they sat quivering on their branches. When he was satisfied they were all there, he took Daphne's hand and was about to lead her back toward the front door when she stopped him. "No, let's find a more fitting end to the day," she said as she nodded toward the backyard. They walked the garden paths quietly, stopping to look at various flowers along the way as the moon inched its way slowly across the sun. When they came to the hyacinth bed, Daphne stopped and stared at a small sprig of heather she had forgotten to pull up that morning when her husband had interrupted her normal routine. To her amazement and joy, it was laying lifeless on the ground, withered and dry. Finally, the soil had changed, and she could move on to spend more time with her other flower beds. She wiped a small tear from her eye, hoping Philip didn't see her in his periphery as he looked at the rose bush in the center of the bed. He did, of course, but his face didn't show it. And when they turned to continue their walk, Celeste appeared from behind a bush to help draw Philip's attention away from Daphne as she tried to compose herself. They continued their stroll and walked over the footbridge to the bench by their pool, where they sat quietly as Celeste wove in and out between their ankles. After a short while, only a small sliver of sun poked out from the edge of the moon, eclipsing it, and they stood to begin the walk back to the house in the evening twilight. When they were crossing the bridge, Philip looked at the trickling water meandering through the orchard on its way to the forest in the background. "I don't think I'll take my evening walk in the woods tomorrow night. If you don't mind, I'll help you plant the vinca in that shady spot by the willow tree instead," said Philip. Daphne was sitting at the dressing table in her nightgown, brushing her hair and muttering, while Philip sat on the edge of the bed and watched. He looked at the vase of lilies on the nightstand as he waited patiently for her to finish, wondering why she had decided to put different flowers in the vase tonight. During the previous week, he'd grown accustomed to the smell of hyacinth in the room every morning when he awoke. As she continued to stroke her long, flaxen hair, it occurred to him that he had one more thing to do before going to bed, so he got up, kissed her on the crown of her head, and told her he'd be right back. He walked through the house and down the gallery hall to his studio, where he picked up the painting of Old Red Eyes from his unfinished painting rack and carried it to a spot at the far end of the gallery where he had arranged a small grouping of his favorite earlier paintings from Briarwood. He hung it on a hook next to the painting of an old country church and stepped back to eye his masterpiece. "Good ending to you, my friend. Now, if you behave yourself, I might just move you down the hall some day and hang you by some other cantankerous old curmudgeons with good hearts that I've had the pleasure to know." As he walked down the hall past his new painting of the two young men on his way to the bedroom, their twinkling eyes seemed to follow him, but he didn't notice. He was too busy thinking about how he might help Daphne forget about the cowlick in her hair. Daphne sighed and then smiled to herself as she snuggled into Philip's chest. Her tangled hair lay haphazardly about her shoulder and pillow as her breathing slowed, and in the quiet afterglow of conjugal bliss, neither she nor Philip were thinking about her cowlick or anything else as the twilight of slumber overtook them. Just as the crescent sliver of the sun disappeared behind the full moon, Philip fell asleep, and then Daphne followed, filling the silence of their bedroom with the soft sounds of their breathing. Before the darkness was summoned, a phantasm appeared at the foot of the bed and then materialized. Their guardian had been with them since they had come together on the savannah years ago, and would remain with them until they reached the mountain and became one, for he was part of their higher self and a messenger from the sun, the guide to their union. When they were awake, he watched their reactions to the day, unseen over their shoulders, and when they were asleep, he watched and guided the action in their dreams, standing over the shoulder of their characters. He looked carefully at the couple lying on the bed before him, and when he was satisfied they were asleep, he freed the forces at his command to knit together the tiny receptacles into which he would lock a single facet of their psyches for the duration of their coming dream. In a single night they must live an entire lifetime of that facet, from its inception as a seed in a newborn child to its growth and final fruition in an aged body. On this night, one of those facets was finally ready to be integrated into their psyches and meet the congregation of their Maker. The guardian breathed out and stood perfectly still. Their nocturnal dwellings were now complete as the pale glow of the moon outside their bedroom window began to cast a dark shadow of their form on the wall, defined by the ghostly rays which surrounded it. As light and darkness intermingled, their dream began.